The island of Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, became a cauldron of unimaginable violence, the last great battle of the Pacific War and one of the bloodiest encounters in military history, where American forces faced a Japanese defense so fanatical and sophisticated that casualties mounted at rates that shocked even hardened veterans of Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and the Philippine campaigns. In the midst of this apocalyptic landscape, where men killed each other with bullets, grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets, in benefit style and so fanatical, where men killed each other with bullets, grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets, where the very ground trembled under constant artillery bombardment, and the air reeked of death and cordite, one soldier moved through the chaos carrying no weapon, refusing on grounds of religious conviction to kill or even to carry a rifle, yet performing acts of heroism so extraordinary that they defied comprehension. His name was Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist from rural Virginia, who enlisted in the Army as a combat medic with a determination to serve his country while adhering absolutely to his interpretation of the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." What Doss accomplished on the Maida Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff that American soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge, in late April and early May of 1945, became one of the most remarkable stories of World War II, a narrative that challenged every assumption about courage, faith, masculinity, and the nature of heroism in combat. German prisoners of war, our war, and a captain to prisoners of war, when they eventually learned the details of Doss's actions, found the story almost incomprehensible, not because German soldiers lacked respect for medical personnel or religious conviction, but because the specific combination of American Protestant pacifism, voluntary military service, and superhuman courage under fire represented something outside their frame of reference, a uniquely American phenomenon that revealed profound truths about faith, conscience, and the complexity of warfare in a democratic society. To understand Desmond Doss and why his story resonated so powerfully, we must begin with his background and the religious tradition that shaped him. Doss was born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, into a working-class family that belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a Protestant denomination that emerged from the Millerite movement of the 1840s and emphasized biblical prophecy, Saturday Sabbath observance, health reform, and a strict interpretation of Scripture. Seventh-day Adventists were, and remain, conscientious cooperators rather than absolute pacifists. Unlike Quakers or Mennonites who refused all military service, Adventists generally agreed to serve in non-combatant roles, particularly as medics, believing they could fulfill their patriotic duty while avoiding the taking of human life. This position reflected a careful theological balance, recognizing the authority of government as ordained by God, while maintaining that the Fifth Commandment's prohibition against killing applied to warfare as well as civilian life. Doss absorbed these teachings from childhood, but his convictions were reinforced by a traumatic personal experience. As a young man, Doss witnessed a violent confrontation between his father and uncle, both of whom had been drinking. His father pulled a gun, and young Desmond had to intervene to prevent a killing. This incident left him with a visceral horror of firearms and violence, a psychological wound that fused with his religious beliefs to create an unshakable determination never to handle a weapon. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and America entered World War II, Doss was working in a shipyard, a position that qualified for draft deferment. He could have legally avoided military service entirely, but Doss believed that if other young men were going to fight and die for their country, he had an obligation to serve as well, to risk his life saving others, even if he could not participate in killing the enemy. Doss enlisted in the Army in April 1942 and requested assignment as a medic. The Army initially agreed to accommodate his religious beliefs, but the reality of military training proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Doss refused to train with weapons, refused to carry a rifle even during drills, and insisted on observing the Saturday Sabbath, refusing to work or trained from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. His fellow soldiers in basic training, and later in his combat unit, the 77th Infantry Division, responded with incomprehension, hostility, and outright persecution to young men raised in a culture that equated masculinity with the willingness to fight and kill. Doss's refusal to carry a weapon seemed like cowardice disguised as religion. They called him a coward to his face. They hazed him mercilessly. Some threatened to kill him in combat, to shoot him themselves, or to fail to protect him when the enemy attacked. Officers tried to have him transferred out of the unit or discharged from the army on psychiatric grounds, believing that a soldier who would not carry a weapon was useless and dangerous to his comrades. Doss endured all of this with patience and determination. He was physically tough, capable of completing all the demanding physical requirements of infantry training. He was intelligent and mastered his medical training thoroughly. He was brave, volunteering for the most dangerous duties during training exercises. Gradually, some of his fellow soldiers began to respect him even if they did not understand him. But the real test would come in combat. The 77th Division deployed to the Pacific Theater and saw action in Guam and Leyte before landing on Okinawa in April 1945. It was on Okinawa, specifically during the assault on Hacksaw Ridge, that Doss would prove beyond any doubt that courage had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with character. Hacksaw Ridge was part of the Maeda Escarpment, a natural defensive position that the Japanese had fortified extensively. The ridge consisted of a steep, rocky cliff face, approximately 400 feet high, honeycombed with caves and tunnels that sheltered Japanese troops and artillery. American forces had to scale cargo nets up the cliff face under fire, then fight across the plateau at the top against entrenched Japanese defenders who were willing to fight to the death. The terrain was nightmarish. Broken ground covered with shell craters, destroyed vegetation, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides. The Japanese defenders employed every weapon available, from rifles and machine guns to mortars, artillery, and grenades. They launched counterattacks at night, infiltrating American positions to kill soldiers in their foxholes. They used suicide tactics, emerging from hidden positions to detonate explosives or engage in hand-to-hand combat. The battle for Hacksaw Ridge and the surrounding area lasted weeks, with American casualties mounting into the thousands. Doss's company participated in the assault on the ridge in late April. On April 29th, during a particularly intense engagement, the company managed to scale the cliff and establish positions on the plateau, but they came under ferocious Japanese counterattack. American soldiers were killed and wounded in terrible numbers. The company commander ordered a retreat back down the cliff to regroup and avoid being overrun. In the chaos of withdrawal, dozens of wounded Americans were left behind on the plateau, unable to move under their own power, and certain to be killed by the Japanese if they were not evacuated. Most soldiers assumed these men were lost. The tactical situation made rescue impossible. Going back would be suicide. Doss refused to leave, as his company retreated down the cargo nets to relative safety below the ridge. Doss remained on the plateau alone, moving through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. What he did over the next several hours defied rational explanation, and would earn him the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. Doss began carrying wounded men to the edge of the cliff. There, he rigged a rope system using a double bowline knot he had learned as a young man, creating a sling that would allow him to lower wounded soldiers down the cliff face, one at a time. He would secure a wounded man in the sling, lower him over the edge, then call down to soldiers at the base of the cliff to remove the casualty and send the rope back up. Then Doss would return into the fire-swept plateau to find another wounded man, drag or carry him back to the cliff edge, and repeat the process. He did this over and over, moving methodically through the most intense combat conditions imaginable. Japanese soldiers were all around him, some as close as 50 yards away. Artillery shells exploded across the plateau. Bullets snapped past him constantly. He was in the open, exposed, an easy target. Yet somehow, he was not hit. He would find a wounded man, sometimes conscious and able to help, sometimes unconscious and requiring Doss to drag him bodily across broken ground. Some men were severely wounded, with limbs blown off, or abdominal wounds. That meant they were likely dying. Doss treated each one, applying tourniquets, administering morphine, bandaging wounds as best he could under fire, then getting them to the cliff edge and lowering them to safety. Between each rescue, according to the accounts of those who survived and witnessed the event, Doss would pray. He would ask God to help him save one more, just one more. Then he would go back into the hell of the plateau and find another wounded man. The prayer became a rhythm, a mantra that sustained him through exhaustion and terror. One more. Let me get one more. He continued this throughout the afternoon and into the evening. As darkness fell, making his work even more dangerous, Doss was still on the plateau, still lowering wounded men. By the time he finally descended the cliff himself, having satisfied himself that he had found every living American on the plateau, he had single-handedly saved approximately 75 men, though some estimates place the number as high as 100 or more. The exact number became a matter of discussion later. Doss initially estimated he had saved 50 men. Others who witnessed the event estimated 100. The Army, characteristically splitting the difference, officially credited him with saving 75 lives, but the precise number matters less than the magnitude of what he accomplished. For hours, alone and unarmed, under intense enemy fire, he had moved across one of the most dangerous pieces of ground in the Pacific War. Finding wounded soldiers and evacuating them to safety. He had refused to leave anyone behind. He had embodied the medical corpsman's commitment that every soldier would be treated, that no one would be abandoned. And he had done it all without firing a shot, without even carrying a weapon. The soldiers who had mocked him and threatened him were stunned. Many owed their lives directly to Doss's actions. They had assumed the conscientious objector was a coward, and he had proven to be the bravest man they had ever seen. The transformation in how his unit viewed Doss was complete and permanent. He became a legendary figure within the 77th Division, the man who had shown more courage than anyone else, whose faith had been vindicated in the most extreme test imaginable. But Doss's ordeal was not over. In the weeks following the Hacksaw Ridge action, he continued serving as a combat medic. On May 5th, during another action, he was wounded by a grenade that peppered his legs with shrapnel. Characteristically, he treated another wounded soldier before allowing himself to be evacuated. While being carried on a stretcher to an aid station, the stretcher bearers came under fire and took cover, setting Doss's stretcher down. Doss, seeing another soldier more seriously wounded, rolled off his stretcher and directed the medics to treat the other man first. He then crawled to cover, evading enemy fire while wounded. During this movement, he was shot in the arm, the bullet shattering his upper arm bone. He bound the wound with a rifle stock as a splint, fashioning the splint from the very weapon he refused to carry, an irony not lost on those who knew his story. He finally reached an aid station and was evacuated to a hospital ship, his war over. The wounds would require extensive treatment and would leave him partially disabled for the rest of his life. For his actions on Hacksaw Ridge and his consistent heroism throughout the Okinawa campaign, Desmond Doss was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman in October 1945. He was the first conscientious objector to receive America's highest military decoration. The citation read in part that he had saved 75 lives through outstanding bravery and selfless devotion to his comrades. Doss received the medal with characteristic humility, insisting that he was simply doing his duty and that God deserved the credit for protecting him and giving him strength. The question of why German prisoners of war would find Doss's story surprising or incomprehensible requires understanding the German military context and how it differed from the American experience. German prisoners of war held in American or British camps were exposed to American media, newspapers, propaganda, and eventually to detailed accounts of American military actions. The Doss story was widely publicized in American media during and after the war as an inspiring example of faith and courage. German POWs who read English or who had access to translated materials would have encountered these accounts. From a German military perspective, several aspects of Doss's story would have been difficult to comprehend. First, the concept of voluntary enlistment by a conscientious objector was foreign to German experience. In Nazi Germany, conscientious objection to military service was not tolerated. Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious groups who refused military service were persecuted, imprisoned in concentration camps, and sometimes executed. The Nazi regime viewed refusal to serve as treasonous and cowardly. The idea that the American military would accept a soldier who refused to carry weapons, would accommodate his religious beliefs about the Sabbath, and would ultimately decorate him as a hero, represented a fundamentally different approach to military service and national defense. Second, the German military had its own traditions regarding medical personnel and their non-combatant status under the Geneva Conventions, but these traditions operated within a military culture that emphasized obedience, uniformity, and the subordination of individual conscience to collective purpose. While German medics were respected and protected under international law, and while German soldiers certainly valued the medics who treated their wounds, the idea of a medic whose religious convictions prevented him from even carrying a weapon for self-defense would have seemed impractical and potentially dangerous to unit cohesion and effectiveness. Third, the specifically Protestant pacifist tradition that informed Doss's beliefs was largely absent from German religious experience. German Protestantism, particularly Lutheranism, had a long tradition of supporting state authority and accepting Christian participation in warfare. The Lutheran doctrine of the two kingdoms held that Christians lived simultaneously in the earthly kingdom, where violence and warfare were sometimes necessary, and the spiritual kingdom where Christ's teachings applied. This theological framework allowed German Christians to participate fully in military service without experiencing the same tension between faith and patriotic duty that troubled American Seventh-day Adventists or Quakers. German Catholicism, while it had its own rich theological tradition, similarly did not produce the kind of individual conscientious objection that characterized some American Protestant denominations. Fourth, the sheer improbability of Doss's survival and success would have struck German POWs as almost miraculous or at least statistically impossible. Professional soldiers understand probabilities and the mechanics of combat. A man moving repeatedly across fire-swept terrain, exposed to enemy observation and fire, surviving for hours while performing complex physical tasks, all without being killed or seriously wounded until much later, represented an outcome so unlikely that it challenged rational explanation. German soldiers, many of whom were combat veterans who had seen countless men killed for making far smaller mistakes or taking far fewer risks, would have struggled to believe that Doss's experience was even possible without divine protection or extraordinary luck. Yet, the documentation of Doss's actions was extensive. Multiple eyewitnesses, both officers and enlisted men, provided sworn statements describing what they had seen. The physical evidence of 75 men evacuated from an apparently hopeless position could not be disputed. The Medal of Honor citation was official government recognition of extraordinary heroism. German POWs who examined this evidence would have been forced to conclude that however improbable the story was true. The broader implications of the Doss story illuminated fundamental differences between American and German approaches to individualism, conscience, and the relationship between citizen and state. America's military culture, despite its emphasis on discipline and obedience, retained a space for individual conscience and religious conviction that was much larger than in the German military. The willingness of the American army to accommodate Doss, however reluctantly and imperfectly, reflected democratic values that recognized limits on state authority over individual belief. The German military, shaped by Prussian traditions and Nazi totalitarianism, recognized no such limits. The individual existed to serve the state and the Volk. Personal religious convictions that conflicted with military duty were not accommodated but suppressed. Doss's story also revealed something important about the nature of courage. The soldiers who initially mocked Doss as a coward were operating from a narrow definition of courage that equated bravery with willingness to kill. This definition was not unique to Americans or Germans, but was nearly universal across military cultures throughout history. Warriors were those who faced the enemy with weapons and the determination to destroy them. By this definition, a man who refused to carry a weapon could not be brave, regardless of what other risks he might take. Doss shattered this definition. He demonstrated that courage was not about weapons or willingness to kill, but about commitment, purpose, and the ability to function effectively under mortal danger. His courage was actually purer than armed courage in some sense, because he placed himself at risk without any means of fighting back, without even the psychological comfort of being able to defend himself. Every moment he spent on Hacksaw Ridge, he was completely vulnerable, dependent entirely on providence or luck for survival. Yet he continued, mission after mission, hour after hour, driven by his commitment to his comrades and his faith in God. This redefinition of courage had theological dimensions that would have been apparent to German POWs who were themselves Christian. The Christian tradition celebrated martyrs who died rather than renounce their faith, who faced death unarmed and unresisting. The image of Christ himself, who submitted to crucifixion without calling down divine vengeance on his executioners, represented the highest form of sacrificial love in Christian theology. Doss, in a very real sense, was following Christ's example, risking death to save others, refusing to participate in killing even when his own life was at stake. This was recognizably Christian behavior, even if it conflicted with the practical requirements of military service and national defense. German POWs grappling with their nation's defeat and the moral catastrophe of Nazi crimes might have found in Doss's story a challenging example of how Christian faith could be lived authentically, even in the midst of total war. The contrast between Doss's principled refusal to kill and the industrial-scale murder of the Holocaust, between his commitment to saving every wounded soldier regardless of cost and the Nazi regime's casual disregard for human life, was stark and uncomfortable. Doss represented a version of Christianity that actually took Christ's teachings seriously, that attempted to live by them even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. This was quite different from the compromised Christianity that had accommodated Nazi ideology or remained silent in the face of atrocities. The practical question of how Doss survived is worth examining. From a purely naturalistic perspective, survival in such circumstances required a combination of factors. Doss was physically fit and capable, able to move efficiently even under stress and exhaustion. He was trained in first aid and knew how to treat wounds quickly and effectively. He was intimately familiar with the terrain after days of fighting, knowing where cover existed and how to move between positions. He worked largely during periods when Japanese attention was focused elsewhere, during lulls in combat, or when Japanese forces were repositioning. He was small in stature, presenting a less obvious target than a larger man. And he was lucky, incredibly lucky, in that despite constant exposure to danger, bullets and shrapnel somehow missed him during the critical hours on Hacksaw Ridge. From a faith perspective, Doss's survival and success were evidence of direct divine intervention. Doss himself never doubted this. He believed God had protected him, had guided him to wounded soldiers, had given him strength to continue when exhaustion and fear should have overwhelmed him. Many of the soldiers he saved came to share this belief, unable to explain their rescue in purely natural terms. The timing of the weather breaks, the periods when Japanese fire slackened just enough for Doss to move, the fact that his rope system worked despite the crude conditions, and his exhaustion, all seemed too fortuitous to be mere chance. Whether one accepts the naturalistic or faith-based explanation, or some combination of both, The objective fact remains that Doss accomplished something extraordinary. He saved approximately 75 men in a situation where any reasonable military calculus would have written them off as losses. He did this while adhering absolutely to his religious convictions, proving that faith and patriotism, conscience and duty, could coexist even in the most extreme circumstances. The legacy of Desmond Doss extends far beyond the immediate military context. His story has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films, most notably the 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects of the story, but all grapple with the same fundamental questions about courage, faith, conscience, and the tension between religious conviction and civic duty. Doss became a symbol of principled resistance to cultural pressure. A man who knew what he believed and refused to compromise even when doing so would have been easier and safer. For German POWs learning about Doss during or after the war, the story must have been deeply troubling in some ways. It demonstrated that the American enemy they had fought was capable of producing individuals of extraordinary moral courage and religious devotion. It showed that democratic societies could accommodate dissent and individual conscience in ways that totalitarian regimes could not. It suggested that perhaps the Americans, for all their material wealth and cultural crudeness that German propaganda emphasized, had access to sources of strength that went beyond industrial capacity or numbers of soldiers. Faith, when genuinely held and consistently lived, created warriors of a different kind, no less dangerous to their enemies, because they saved lives rather than taking them. The improbability of Doss's story, the fact that it seems almost too extraordinary to be true, is precisely what makes it historically significant. In a war that killed approximately 70 million people worldwide, that featured industrial-scale atrocity and destruction, that reduced ancient cities to rubble and turned entire regions into wastelands, the story of one unarmed man saving 75 lives through faith and determination became a powerful counter-narrative. It suggested that individual moral choice still mattered, that conscience could triumph over conformity, that faith could produce courage equal or superior to anything motivated by patriotism or ideology. For German POWs who had served a regime that demanded absolute obedience and crushed individual conscience, who had participated in or witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, the Desmond Doss story offered a troubling alternative vision of what military service could be, of how faith and duty might be reconciled without sacrificing either. Desmond Doss died in 2006 at the age of 87, having lived a long life marked by the physical consequences of his wounds and by the recognition of his heroism. He remained humble about his accomplishments, always crediting God and downplaying his own role. The Medal of Honor he received remained the only such decoration awarded to a conscientious objector during World War II. His example continues to challenge easy assumptions about courage, faith, and the relationship between religious conviction and military service, standing as testimony that the unarmed healer can display greater bravery than the armed warrior, that faith genuinely held can enable superhuman acts of compassion, even in the midst of history's most terrible conflicts.